The quiet life of the plow and the harrow. Imagine, if you will, a wide medieval field stretching out beneath a pale ochre dawn. The air smells faintly of damp earth. Smoke from nearby cottages drifts gently across the hedgerows. And in the middle of the quiet scene stands one of the most important tools of the Middle Ages, the plow. It is not ornate, not gilded, not carved with symbols of power or grace. It is wood and iron, heavy and awkward, yet it was the foundation of survival. Without it, bread would not be baked, rent could not be paid, and villages could not endure. The plow was not new to the Middle Ages, but it came into its own in these centuries. Earlier peoples had used lighter scratch plows, drawn by men or oxen, suitable for softer soils. But as medieval farmers expanded into the heavy, damp soils of northern Europe, new designs appeared. The heavy plow, with its iron plowshare, coulter, and moldboard, cut deep into the soil and turned furrows over. Its arrival changed landscapes. Forests were cleared, wetlands drained, fields carved into neat lines. Where once only small plots could be cultivated, now entire regions opened to grain. The tool itself was simple in appearance. A wooden frame, reinforced with iron fittings, a long beam stretching forward to the yoke of oxen. At its heart, the plowshare cut the soil, the coulter sliced vertically, and the moldboard turned the clod aside. The result was a neat furrow, dark soil exposed, ready for seed. It was a dull sight, perhaps soil turned over, line after line, but it was revolutionary in its quiet way. Operating a plow was no small matter. It required strength, skill, and patience. A plowman walked behind, hands steady on the handles, guiding the team of oxen or horses. The animals strained, hooves sinking into earth, breath steaming in cool air. Each line of furrow was straightened with care, for crooked furrows wasted land and seed. The pace was slow, deliberate, repetitive. Step, push, guide, pause, then again, line after line. Oxen were the most common draft animals. Strong, hardy, and capable of pulling heavy loads, they suited the thick soils of the north. They were slower than horses but cheaper to maintain, feeding on rough grasses instead of expensive oats. In wealthier areas, horses became more common, their speed cutting plowing time dramatically. To use them, farmers developed the horse collar, a padded harness that allowed the animal's shoulders to bear the load without choking. Such innovations seem small, but they changed everything. With horses, a field that once took days to plow could be finished in half the time. After the plow came the harrow. Where the plow carved furrows, the harrow smoothed them. Made of wooden frames with iron teeth, it was dragged across the field to break up clods of earth and cover seed once scattered. The sound of its teeth rattling over stones was familiar across medieval Europe, a reminder of preparation before the rains. The harrow, less celebrated than the plow, was equally vital. Without it, seed lay exposed, eaten by birds or scorched by sun. Together, plow and harrow created the rhythm of farming. The year turned on their work. In spring, or autumn. Depending on region, fields were plowed, harrowed, and sown. Villages marked time not by clocks, but by the sight of furrows stretching across land, by the creak of wooden beams, by the lowing of oxen. It was boring, perhaps, yet it was the very fabric of survival. Manorial records speak of plowing as an obligation. Peasants owed their lords days of plow service, bringing animals and tools to work the lord's domain fields. Failure to plow properly could bring fines. In return, lords sometimes provided iron fittings or repairs, for plows wore quickly. Iron was costly, and many peasants struggled to maintain their tools. A broken plowshare could mean disaster, seed unplanted, fields wasted, hunger ahead. Community life often gathered around plowing. Villagers helped one another, lending oxen or sharing plows. Few households could afford a full team, so neighbors pooled animals into a team of 8, each man guiding his share of the yoke. The image of communal plowing, men shouting, animals straining, soil turning in long lines, captures the collective effort of survival. The plow even entered language and symbol. To take the plow meant to farm, to work, to provide. Sermons used plows as metaphors for spiritual labor, the priest guiding souls like a plowman guiding oxen, furrows as the paths of virtue. The plow, ordinary though it seemed, stood for diligence, toil, and life itself. And so, in the dull creak of wood and iron, in the repetitive furrows stretching across a damp field, we see the quiet hero of medieval survival. Yet one question lingers as we leave the plow standing in its field. How did the harvest of these plowed lands sustain the entire structure of medieval society? Lords, monasteries, towns, and what hidden tools beyond the plow ensured that survival continued? Sickles, scythes, and flails, the humble tools of harvest. The medieval year was a long preparation for harvest. Plows cut the soil, harrows smoothed it, seed was sown, and then the waiting began. But when the crops ripened, when golden fields bowed under the weight of grain, it was time for other tools to take their place. Smaller, lighter, handheld tools that demanded patience, rhythm, and endurance. These were the sickle, the scythe, and the flail. Forgotten by grandeur, these tools shaped every loaf of bread, every measure of ale, every meal that crossed medieval tables. The sickle was perhaps the most iconic. Small, curved, with a sharp iron blade and wooden handle, it fit neatly into a laborer's hand. Its curve allowed the reaper to sweep through stalks of grain in a tight arc, cutting low to the ground. With sickles, harvest was slow and intimate. A man or woman stooped, grasped a bundle of stalks in one hand, and sliced with the other. Bundle by bundle, sheaves were gathered and laid in neat rows. The work was exhausting, backs bent, fingers raw, but it was essential. Without the sickle, fields of wheat and barley remained only promise. Sickles were also symbolic. In images and manuscripts, the sickle often appears in the hands of peasants, saints, and allegorical figures. Its shape echoed the moon, a reminder of cycles and time. Its presence marked the season of labor, the turning of summer into autumn. Though simple in design, the sickle represented survival, community, and the inevitability of harvest. Later, the scythe joined the harvest. Longer than the sickle, with a straight wooden shaft and a wide, sweeping blade, it could cut swaths of grass or grain far more quickly. Where the sickle gathered carefully, the scythe mowed. Men swung it in long arcs, rhythmically, blades flashing in the sun. A line of scythemen could clear a field of hay or oats with speed unmatched by hand sickles. But the scythe was not only practical, it was also dangerous. Its blade, long and sharp, required strength and balance to wield. The scythe, too, became an enduring symbol. In Christian art and later folklore, the scythe became the tool of death itself, the grim reaper cutting lives as men cut wheat. This association reflected how deeply embedded the tool was in imagination. Every villager knew the sight of a scythe sweeping through stalks, the sound of stalks falling in rhythm. It was natural that the scythe would symbolize the harvest of human lives. Once the grain was cut and gathered into sheaves, it was stacked, dried, and prepared for threshing. Here entered another humble tool, the flail. Two sticks joined by a leather thong, it was wielded with both hands. One stick served as handle, the other swung down onto bundles of grain, breaking kernels free from husks. The sound of flails beating on barn floors was the music of winter. Thump, 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 steady, repetitive, dull, but life-giving. Threshing was often communal work. Families and neighbors gathered in barns, men and women taking turns at flailing, children helping to collect loosened grain. Dust rose in shafts of light, chaff floated in the air, and sweat dampened tunics. It was boring work, monotonous, but it transformed stalks into food. Flails endured for centuries, unchanged, because they were effective, cheap, and versatile. From a lord's perspective, these tools mattered for rents and dues. Peasants owed a portion of their harvest, measured in sheaves, bushels, or sacks. The sickles cut, the scythes swing, the flails beat, all fed into manorial records. In towns, guild bakers and brewers relied on the steady supply of grain cut and threshed by such tools. Lords might wield swords, priests chalices, merchants scales, but peasants wielded sickles, scythes, and flails, and without them, no other tool of power could be sustained. Yet these tools were not only instruments of labor, they were part of culture. Songs and proverbs referenced them. Villages held harvest feasts where sickles were decorated. Flails hung in barns as symbols of fertility and luck. Even in rebellion, these tools played a role. Chronicles sometimes describe peasants wielding scythes and flails as weapons during uprisings. Their farm tools turned into instruments of defiance. The rhythms of these tools shaped the medieval year. Sickles in late summer, scythes in hayfields, flails in winter barns. Each tool brought its own sounds and movements, binding communities to cycles of labor. Unlike the grand plow or mill, these tools were personal, held in hand, carried from field to barn, passed from parent to child. They were extensions of the body, reminders that survival lay in muscle and repetition as much as in iron and wood. Picture, then, a barn in early winter. Sheaves stacked high, villagers gathered with flails. The air is dusty, shafts of sunlight breaking through cracks in the boards. The steady rhythm of flails striking grain fills the room. Children laugh as they chase stray kernels. Women sweep chaff into piles. Men take turns at the hard labor. Outside, snow begins to fall, but inside, the flails carry on. It is monotonous, ordinary, yet it is the heartbeat of survival. And as we leave this scene, one question lingers. Beyond the tools of harvest, how did medieval people preserve, measure, and guard their precious grain? What other implements, granary locks, measures, sieves, ensured that grain remained safe until it became bread? The harvest, once cut and threshed, did not end its journey in the barn. Grain was life, and life needed guarding. In an age without refrigeration, without canned goods or chemical preservatives, the difference between plenty and famine rested on how well a community stored and measured what it had. This is where quieter, less glamorous tools came into play. The sieve, the granary, the lock, and the humble measuring scoop. Each was dull in appearance, yet each carried the weight of survival. The sieve came first in the process. After threshing, grain still carried fragments of chaff, dust, and stones. Sieves, woven of horsehair, reeds, or later fine wire, were used to separate the edible from the inedible. A woman shook the sieve gently, rhythmically, the finer kernels falling through while debris remained behind. The act was repetitive, requiring patience. Sieving was often done in kitchens, where the sound of grain against mesh joined the crackle of fires. For the wealthy, sieves helped produce fine flour for white bread. For peasants, coarse sieves sufficed, leaving a mix of bran and grain that produced darker loaves. Next came the matter of storage. Grain could not simply be left in piles, for moisture, rodents, and insects would quickly destroy it. Instead, medieval communities built granaries, structures raised on stilts or stone piers, with wooden floors and slatted walls. These kept grain dry, aired, and safe from vermin. The sight of a granary, perched above the ground like a small hut, was common in villages and monasteries alike. Some were communal, storing grain for entire communities, while others belonged to lords or abbeys, serving as both warehouse and treasury. To store grain was to hold power. Lords collected grain as rent, filling their granaries with the labor of peasants. Monasteries, often better organized, maintained vast reserves to feed monks, pilgrims, and the poor. In towns, merchant granaries stored grain for trade, their locks and ledgers guarded closely. A full granary meant security, an empty one meant anxiety. The presence or absence of rats, the dryness of beams, the vigilance of watchmen. Such details shaped survival more than battles or kings. Locks and keys, too, were tools of survival. Granaries and barns were secured with iron locks. and keys became symbols of authority. A steward or reeve often held the keys, his responsibility immense. To misplace a key or leave a granary unlocked could be ruinous. The sound of a key turning in iron was not just practical, it was a reassurance that food was safe. In an era when hunger haunted every year, a lock was as important as a sword. Measuring tools were equally vital. Grain was collected, sold, and consumed in specific quantities: bushels, pecks, quarters. Wooden scoops, marked with lines, ensured uniformity. In manorial courts, disputes often arose over measures, with peasants accusing lords or stewards of false accounting. To guard fairness, some towns established official measures kept in guild halls, against which all others were checked. A dishonest measure could spark unrest as surely as a famine. Within households, smaller measures guided daily life. A woman measuring grain for porridge or bread relied on her scoop to stretch reserves carefully. Each handful mattered, each kernel counted. In times of plenty, measures were generous. In times of want, scoops grew thin and bowls less full. A wooden measure, worn smooth from use, carried the story of a family's fortunes more clearly than many chronicles. Granaries themselves could be places of conflict. In years of shortage, rumors of hoarding abounded. Lords accused of keeping granaries locked while villagers starved faced resentment. Bread riots, when they came, often began with attacks on bakeries and granaries. To break a lock, to seize grain, was both crime and survival. The humble lock and scoop, then, became instruments of justice or injustice in the eyes of the hungry. Preservation methods added another layer of quiet ingenuity. Grain was sometimes dried in kilns, slow fires ensuring kernels lasted through damp winters. Salted sacks and sealed clay jars added protection. Even cats, kept in barns to ward off mice, were part of this system of preservation. Each small act, the drying, the sealing, the setting of a cat to watch, was a tool as much as any plow or sickle. The importance of these tools was reflected in law and custom. Manorial records list disputes over sieves, measures, and granary access. Monastic rules specified how grain was to be stored and who held the keys. Town ordinances dictated bread weight and flour quality, tying the act of measurement to civic pride. Behind every loaf lay a chain of trust in these tools. Trust that grain was clean, that measures were fair, that granaries were secure. Picture, if you will, a granary at dusk. Raised on stone piers, its wooden walls glow faintly in torchlight. A steward locks the heavy door with an iron key, slipping it into his belt. Villagers watch silently, some reassured, others resentful. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of grain, thousands of kernels whispering in silence. Each sack represents days of labor, each stack months of survival. The building is ordinary, yet within it lies the future of a community. So we see how sieves, granaries, locks, and measures, tools so plain they rarely merit mention in chronicles, were in truth pillars of survival. They lacked the grandeur of swords or the drama of crowns, but they mattered more. They were the quiet machinery of sustenance, the overlooked implements that determined whether a winter was endured or a famine remembered. And yet, one final question remains before we leave these barns and granaries behind. How did such tools and methods feed into the wider cycles of trade, rent, and obligation? How did the stored grain of a village become the taxes of a king, the profits of a merchant, the bread of a pilgrim far from home? From barn to market, grain, rent, and obligation. The story of medieval farm tools does not end in the fields, nor in the barns where grain lay stacked. To understand their full place in history, we must follow grain beyond the village, outward to the wider world of rents, markets, and obligations. A sickle's cut, a flail's strike, a scoop's measure, all reverberated far beyond the barn floor. These ordinary tools quietly upheld not only households, but entire kingdoms. Grain was wealth, not gold, not jewels, but sacks of rye, wheat, and barley. These sustained lords, abbeys, towns, and kings. In manorial life, peasants owed grain as rent. Sometimes they delivered sheaves to the lord's granary. Sometimes they owed plowing days on the lord's fields, their own tools pressed into service. These obligations, written in manorial rolls, turned simple tools into instruments of law. A sickle was not only a blade, it was a bond between villager and lord. The journey began in the domain fields. After plowing, harrowing, harvesting, and threshing, peasants carried portions of their yield to the manor. Stewards, armed with measures and ledgers, checked each delivery. Scoops and bushels determined fairness or exploitation. To a peasant, the difference of a handful was a day's meal. To a steward, it was accounting. Behind the apparent dullness of measurement lay real stakes: hunger or surplus, debt or survival. Some of the collected grain stayed local. Lords fed their households, monasteries their monks and guests, towns their bakers. But much grain traveled further. Markets thrived on its movement. Villagers carried sacks to town squares, selling to merchants who in turn shipped grain down rivers or across seas. Barges on the Thames, cogs in the Baltic, mules on Alpine passes, all carried the humble kernels reaped with sickles and stored with care. Markets brought new tools into play. Scales weighed sacks, balances tested fairness, and civic officials enforced the assize of bread, laws dictating loaf size and price. Bakers were inspected, their loaves weighed against official standards. Grain could not be hoarded or sold unfairly without risk of penalty. Thus, the farm tools that began the journey, plows, sickles, flails, ended up enmeshed in civic regulation, their products shaping the rhythm of towns. The church, too, drew its share. Tithes, 1/10 of a harvest, were owed to parish churches. Sacks of grain filled tithe barns, long wooden structures with doors high enough to admit wagons. Tools carried symbolic weight here. The flail's beating was echoed in sermons, the sieve in parables, the plow in metaphors of spiritual labor. To give grain was not merely economic, it was religious duty, reinforced by ritual. In monasteries, grain became part of a grand cycle of giving and receiving. Monks tilled their own fields, but also collected rents. They stored grain in vast granaries, distributing loaves to the poor at gates, hosting feasts for pilgrims. The scythe and flail, humble in themselves, became instruments of charity when their products passed through monastic bakehouses. Tools of toil became tools of mercy. Beyond local rents and tithes lay taxation for kings and princes. Grain-fed armies supplied courts and filled treasuries when sold abroad. A levy in sacks of wheat might support a crusade. Barley collected from villages might become ale for soldiers. Thus, the flail's thump in a barn echoed faintly in distant wars. Tools of labor in one village connected, through rents and taxes, to decisions made in castles and courts. The value of these tools lay not only in what they produced, but in the continuity they ensured. Year after year, plows carved, sickles cut, flails struck, sieves sifted. Without fail, these acts repeated, feeding the steady flow of rents, tithes, and markets. Knights might rise and fall, kings quarrel, abbots dispute, but the tools carried on, season after season, their monotony the very basis of stability. Yet this quiet continuity also carried fragility. When famine struck, tools lost their power. A plow could not conjure wheat from drowned fields, nor a flail separate kernels from empty husks. In those years, rents went unpaid, markets faltered, armies starved. The absence of harvest revealed how much rested on the humblest implements. Without them, entire systems trembled. Still, in ordinary years, their work endured. Picture, then, a medieval market square. Stalls shaded with canvas, sacks of grain piled high, bakers haggling, merchants weighing, townsfolk queuing for loaves. Amid the bustle, no one notices the origin of it all. The curved sickle, the heavy flail, the sieve shaken over a bowl. These tools, left behind in barns and cottages, had already played their part. The market scene was merely the echo of their quiet labor. And so we close this story where it began, in ordinariness. Forgotten tools, the plow, the harrow, the sickle, the scythe, the flail, the sieve, were not glamorous. They did not gleam in chronicles or glitter in treasure hoards. Yet without them, no feast was held, no army marched, no prayer of thanksgiving spoken over bread. They were the background of history, the unnoticed machinery of survival. The question lingers as we step away from these fields and barns. If such ordinary tools upheld medieval life, what other forgotten instruments, perhaps in kitchens, workshops, or ships, quietly shaped history while leaving little mark in chronicles?